الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. Dear Professor Edward R.MOAD, our professors, doctors, our researchers, our students, the participants who are in the Zoom and in the YouTube channel, welcome to our ISTAC World Professorial Lecture number 23. Alhamdulillah, with the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we managed in the last 1.5 years, to conduct 22 professorial lecture under the International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization. In these lectures, we invited great scholars from Malaysia and from elsewhere in the world. And we addressed many important topics of merit and interest to the Ummah and to Malaysia here, to the Islamic world, and to the world. We touched on areas of religion, worldview, civilization, culture, environment, economy, bioethics, and many other areas, brothers and sisters. Alhamdulillah, with the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, today we are having with us another scholar to deliver the ISTAC World Professorial Lecture on a very important topic, though specialized, but it's very important as the topic bridges the West and the East and brings the minds that really were great minds. Our Professor Edward R.MOAD today will be speaking about coherence of the incoherence, Al-GHAZALI, Ibn Rushd, and the scientific mind. Dear brothers and sisters, before I pass the mic to Professor R.MOAD, this is a brief biography of our professor today. Professor R.MOAD said about himself, "I am interested in Islamic comparative philosophy and tend to use a comparative approach to explore new insights on problems in metaphysics, moral epistemology, and philosophy of religion." Brothers and sisters, our professor today graduated with a Ph.D. in philosophy from University of Missouri, Columbia, and also an M.E. in philosophy from the same university, and a bachelor degree in philosophy from Northwest Missouri State University. Our professor has worked in many places, and currently he is a professor in the department, in the Faculty of Humanities in QATAR University. He worked before in other places, example, a research fellow in the Department of Philosophy, National University of Singapore. He worked also in the Department of Philosophy, University of Texas, Pan American. Our professor also has published widely and lectured widely and presented papers in many international conferences. An example, one of his recent books is a book on coherence of the incoherence, Al-GHAZALI, Ibn Rushd, and the indescribable recurrences. Some of his articles published in well-known journals worldwide, example, Occasionalism and Contemporary Analysis of Causation, Universalizability, Concurrence, and Occasionalism, a confusion insight on the contemporary human condition, Between Divines, another article, between divine simplicity and the eternity of the world. Ghazali on the necessity of the necessary existent in the incoherence of the philosophers. Another one, Al-Ghazali's position on the second proof of the philosophers for the eternity of the world. Another article, the good, the bad, and the obligatory in Al-Ghazali's Al-Mustasfa. Another one, comparing phases of skepticism in Al-Ghazali and Descartes, some first meditations on the deliverance from error. Many of them. Another one on Al-Ghazali on power, causation, and accusation. Other publications, chapters in books, articles, example, Al-Ghazali and natural law theory, Ibn Khaldun, and occasionalism. He also published some works on the encyclopedia entries. For example, The Self, Oxford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Science and Technology in Islam. Another one, Ibn Baja, Oxford Encyclopedia, Ibn Tufail, Oxford Encyclopedia, and also Sufism. Brothers and sisters, our professor today also presented papers in many countries and universities, including in Oxford, in Qatar, in Kuala Lumpur, in Jakarta, in Turkey, in Dubai, and in many other places, brothers and sisters. So today, our scholar will be speaking to us on this very important topic. As you are all aware, brothers and sisters, talking about this issue of Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd and linking it to the idea of the scientific mind is really something vital to the development of our understanding of Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd, and also our understanding of the Islamic philosophy in our contemporary time. Once again, I would like to welcome our people, our professors, our doctors who are here, who are in the Zoom and in the YouTube channel. Thank you for coming to the ISTAC World Professorial 23, and I leave it to Professor Moad to speak for 1 hour in the topic, and then we will open for questions and answers, inshallah. Go ahead, Prof.
The one? Yeah, okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for your invitation, Professor Abdulaziz, and for your generous introduction. You had a long list of publications from my CV, but actually it's not hard to publish a lot of papers over time. You have to start early, and the quality of them may not be as high as the titles suggest. So I hope that what I present today will be better than those things that if you ever dig them up, you might wonder why they were mentioned at all. But you have to put everything you can on your CV. That's how the academic life goes. Okay, but today I want to basically introduce a book, my first book, real book. It'll be published within a month, inshallah. And that's the title of the book, The Coherence of the Incoherence. And it's the first volume of what I intend to be 2 volumes. I'm trying to provide a kind of a critical commentary on the entire debate between Ghazali and Ibn Rushd. And I've divided that into 2 sections because it's quite a large topic for one book. This first volume is regarding nature and the cosmos. And the second volume, inshallah, will be about God and the soul. That's it's a good way to divide the topics that they debate. Today, I want to introduce the book, and along the way, basically what I'm going to do is read a bit from the introduction of the book. And I want to draw some, like what I can call rules of thumb or characteristics of a scientific mind, which can be gleaned from the debate between both of these figures and how they conduct the debate between each other. So obviously, that's what a little bit of what I mean by the coherence of the incoherence. I want to get past the polemic of taking one side or the other and look more closely at the actual arguments that they gave and learn from both. So I'm told that I can do this to share the screen. Let's see if it works. Yes. All right. Yes. And if I do that, okay, good. Right. So here's the, you're hearing me okay? All right. Yeah. So this is about what we can learn from these two about how to have a scientific mind. Maybe I should have written also about how to learn how to be a good public speaker. I tend to get nervous and get quiet. So if I do that, let me know. I'll try to speak up again. That's a different topic, scientific mind and public speaker. But being a good public speaker also is an important thing, an important skill to learn. I'm not the one to teach about that, though. So, right. This is the book here. This is the cover of the book. I'm told by the publisher, Gorgias Press, to announce to everybody that they have a special offer, a 30% discount on all pre-orders. So if you go to that website there and, type in this promo code, mode 30% before the 5th of August, you'll get 30% off the price of the book, which is not going to help much because they're charging $114 for the book, which is really ridiculous. So maybe even just the library can get a discount if you want to get one copy for the library, right? Just wait for the library to get it and you can look it up then. Maybe they'll come out with a paperback copy, a cheaper one if there's a demand. Anyhow, enough for the sales pitch. We'll get right on to the presentation here. So what I'm going to do is, well, everybody I think knows about this, but we should, introduce this. Al-Ghazali, born 1058 and died 1111, wrote the book Tuhafat al-Philosopher, as well known, and Ibn Rushd, who was born in 1126, died in 1198, wrote the response, the Tuhafat al-Tahafut, right? And I think we're well aware of the controversy since then, especially in modern times. For example, people blaming Al-Ghazali for destroying the scientific mind of the Muslim Ummah, right? That's not the only polemic. There are actually a number of different factions, right, that use this for their own purposes, right? We don't need to talk about different sorts of factions, but I do find that the discussion in the Muslim world is a little bit mired in these polemics between factions and loyalists, right? And I want to try to get beyond that, right? It's already been well established that it's not true that Ghazali has destroyed the Muslim mind and the Ummah. So I don't need to talk about that. It's already been proven by others, right? And to do that requires looking at more than just the Tuhafat al-Philosopher or actually part of that's there, but you have to also look at the history of thought before and after Ghazali, which has been done by others better than me. So I'm going to keep that as the premise. That's a premise of what's to follow, not something that I intend to prove, but I consider it to be already established. The debate between Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd is not between religion and science, but I approach it as one between two religious scientists, right? Understood in the different senses that can be understood. That is to say that they are scientists who are religious, and at the same time, they are scientific about religion, right? My thesis here is that by reading both of them together and balancing them against each other, we can form an exemplary model of the scientific mind, or at least we can begin to form such a model, right? And what I mean is a sort of description of the scientifically virtuous person, the virtues of the scientific mind, the sort of habits of thought that, enable somebody to be more effective at thinking about a problem, any kind of problem. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce my examination of the debate. Basically, I'm going to read from some of the introduction to my book, which is in fact an examination of the introduction that Ghazali gives to his own book, right? A number of introductions, if you're familiar with it, you know. And also some of Ibn Rushd's response to some of those elements of his introduction. Ibn Rushd doesn't himself provide a large introduction to his response. And it's interesting to me that he doesn't recount Ghazali's introductions. Ibn Rushd's copy of the Tahafut al-Philosopher, which he includes in his Tahafut al-Tahafut, doesn't include Ghazali's introductions. It just dives right into the first chapter. And that, I think, has some interesting ramifications of that with regard to how Ibn Rushd responds to Ghazali. But we'll get to that as we get there. And along the way, I'm going to be listing these rules of thumb. So the PowerPoint slides are going to show you some of the characteristics or the virtues of the scientific mind, which I think we can draw from this. And what I'm going to be reading is, right, another topic like about the introduction. Okay. So when you read the introduction of the Tahafut al-Philosopher, one of the things you notice is that Ghazali is not really directly concerned with the philosopher. He's concerned with a group of people that I'm going to call the philosophical posers. That's to say, people who are pretending to be philosophers, but Ghazali says they're not really philosophers. They don't really understand philosophy, but rather they are following a kind of taqlid, right? Of high-sounding names. He says they hear these high-sounding names like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and they believe that by, you know, describing themselves as followers of these people, that they kind of come above the general public and they're smarter than other people. They don't have to follow religious rules as closely, right, as others for that reason. So that's what Ghazali's concerned about. Now, if you think about that, what's interesting is that Ghazali's problem here is actually one that the philosopher, in fact, share. Because if you recall in Al-Farabi's Perfect City, right, one of the problems, right, politically and socially that Al-Farabi discusses is exactly that, the pretenders of philosophy, right, the people who discuss philosophy but aren't truly philosophers, right, and they cause a problem. Yeah, so they actually share a similar problem. Yeah. Ghazali is writing here to show, as he says, that these philosophical posers, he wants to show the philosophical, what I'm calling the philosophical posers, that they have overestimated the degree of certainty that the philosopher have reached in metaphysics. And he wants to do so by examining the philosopher arguments, the arguments specifically of Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi. So a question I raise, and I don't have a conclusive answer to, does Ghazali include Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi in the category of philosophical posers, or are they those who he considers to be the true philosophers? Because in fact, he says that he's going to prove that the true philosophers are not unbelievers, but they don't deny God, they don't deny the hereafter. Although there's a sort of contradiction that's been pointed out in the literature that in the conclusion, right, he gives them the judgment of takfir against them for these three views. Yeah. So there's some tension and between what he says in the introduction and the conclusion. And I discussed that in the book, but I'm not going to discuss that here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start right off the part where we're going to ask how the philosopher would deal with the philosophical posers, given that it looks like Ghazali and the philosopher are actually dealing with the same problem. Yeah, Ghazali's writing the Tahafut al-Philosopher as a kind of a response to a problem which Al-Farabi himself recognizes and has his own response to. Perhaps the philosopher would deal with philosophical posers by trying to convince them that by either nature or lack of education, so to speak, they should, so to speak, go back to their day jobs, right? A weakness of that approach is that the poser can just as easily throw the same line back, claiming that his critic is the one out of his depth. Who then is the real philosopher and who is the poser? In his fourth introduction, Ghazali mentions this tactic as a way that either the philosopher or their opposers try to shield their arguments from scrutiny. Yeah. And you'll notice here, actually, I would need to point out, I'm using the term falsafa or philosopher and the term philosophy and philosophers differently. And we should do that, right? Philosophy is not just falsafa and, right? To think so is to assume that the only way a Muslim can be philosophical is to follow, right? Exactly the ideology and the doctrine of what are really just a specific number of particular philosophers. Yeah. Okay. Or in other words, if you want to put it this way, if Kierkegaard can be a philosopher and Wittgenstein can be called a philosopher, right? But you can only be a Muslim philosopher if you follow Aristotle, something's wrong here. Okay. So we should use these terms differently. And people already do. I'm not new to that. That's already something in the literature. Right. But as he's pointing out here, the philosopher or their posers, either one, are trying to shield their views from scrutiny by some tactic. He says one of the tricks they use in inciting people when confronted with a difficulty in the course of an argument is to say these metaphysical sciences are obscure and hidden, being the most difficult of the sciences for intelligent minds. One can only arrive at knowing the answer to these difficulties through the introduction of mathematics and logic. Thus, whoever imitates them in unbelief when confronted with a difficulty in their doctrine would think well of them and say, no doubt their sciences include a resolution of this difficulty, but it is difficult for me to apprehend it since I have neither mastered logic nor attained mathematics. To whom is Ghazali referring to here as using this trick? The true philosophe or the poser? Marmora, in his translation, appears to assume that Ghazali is referring to the philosophe. But the matter is as ambiguous as that of whether they are unbelievers. His description of the second speaker as the one who imitates might at first seem to imply that the first speaker is one of the philosopher whom the posers are imitating. That's not necessarily so, for one imitator can imitate another imitator. Furthermore, the second speaker here is described as imitating the first in their unbelief. So if we take Ghazali on his word in the preface that the true philosopher were not unbelievers, then the first speaker, that is those who play the trick here, must be the posers. Likewise, if we apply Farabi's standard, a true philosophe would not be engaging in a metaphysical debate with an unqualified person in the first place. Whoever the trickster is, Ghazali summarily calls him out. As for mathematics, he explains, its object is either its object is either discrete quantity, arithmetic, or continuous quantity, geometry, neither of which, he says, are relevant to metaphysics. As for arithmetic, he simply dismisses as nonsense the claim that metaphysics requires it. As for geometry, he associates it with investigating the shape and structure of the cosmos, the number and arrangement of the spheres and their movements. This, he claims, is also irrelevant for metaphysics. He writes, for this is as if someone were to say that the knowledge that this house came to be through the work of a knowing, willing, living builder, endowed with power, requires that one knows that the house is either a hexagon or an octagon, and that one know the number of its supporting frames and the number of its bricks, which is raving its falsity obvious. Or that one does not know that this onion is temporally originated unless he knows the number of its layers, and does not know that this pomegranate is temporally originated unless he knows the number of its seeds. This raises a question. The contention, essentially, is that natural science has no bearing on metaphysics. The analogous metaphysical question drawn from the first example would be whether the cosmos and its contents came to be through the work of a knowing, willing, powerful creator. The apparent implication here is that we cannot arrive at an answer to that question by inferring from what we know about the natural structure of these things. This would seem to preclude any teleological design argument premised on observations of that order and the structure. Yet in other works, I think as you well know, Ghazali does just that. In his major theological text, Al-Iqtisad fi al-I'tiqad, he argues that since the world is a well-ordered act, and every well-ordered act proceeds from a knowing and powerful agent, then the world proceeds from a knowing and powerful agent. Part of the evidence he produces for the first premise, moreover, is based on the observation that the compartments of a beehive are hexagonal and therefore optimal for fitting the round shape of the bee without wasting space. Knowing that a house is hexagonal may not be necessary for knowing that it had an intelligent designer, but knowing that a beehive is hexagonal is apparently sufficient for knowing that it did. Unless we can know the world is a well-ordered act without knowing anything about its natural structure, it's hard to see how one can maintain that natural science has no connection to the question of whether the world has a knowing, willing, powerful creator. So there's some tension between it seems, the two claims that he made here. I'm not saying that it can't be reconciled, but I am saying that it's a question that we should tackle, right? We should ask about. And that leads me to the first rule or virtue of a scientific mindset. That is that it requires close attention to the relation between empirical and metaphysical claims. Yeah. Logic, Ghazali affirms, is a prerequisite for metaphysics. This raises another crucial question. Does Ghazali here mean to imply positively that we can arrive at metaphysical knowledge through logic? Or does he merely mean that logic is necessary for systematically engaging in discussions of metaphysics? This is important because the latter interpretation is compatible with the position that metaphysical knowledge is not possible at all through the exercise of unaided reason. In either case, while affirming that logic is necessary for metaphysics, Ghazali emphasizes that it is neither exclusive to the philosopher nor limited in its expression to their technical terminology. Theologians and jurists also understand and practice this discipline, albeit under a different name. He will thus confine himself, he says, to the logical terminology of the philosopher, not only to avoid any systematic obfuscation, but also in order to judge their arguments according to their own rules. He writes, "We will make it plain that what they set down as a condition for the truth of the matter of the syllogism in the part on demonstrating the logic, and what they set forth as a condition for its form in the book of the syllogism, and the various things they posited in the isagogue and the categories, which are parts of logic and its preliminaries, are things none of which they have been able to fulfill in the metaphysical sciences." Ghazali promises to make it plain that the arguments of the philosopher offer for their metaphysical claims have failed to meet their own epistemic standards. But this requires that the reader understand those standards. Thus, he included a primer on logic at the end of the book. He also refers the reader to his Mi'yar al-Ilm, the standard of knowledge, a separate book on logic. Logic, he says, is, quote, concerned with examining the instrument of thought in intelligible things. He explains, there is no significant disagreement encountered in these. In that case, we have a shared set of clearly defined ground rules for the debate. So long as Ghazali's exposition of his opponent's arguments is complete and accurate, it should be a straightforward procedure to determine whether they meet the standards of proof laid out by their own logic. If so, then Ghazali will have equipped the reader with the means to judge the outcome of the debate for herself. What he promises is empowering, respectful of the reader's intellect, and genuinely philosophical. It remains for us to evaluate the degree to which he has fulfilled this promise. Which brings me to my second lesson for the scientific mind that we can draw from this, which is that the scientific mindset requires clarity and openness about the epistemic standards we are deploying. Having clarified Ghazali's proposed methodology, it remains to review the parameters of the discussion which he lays out in the first three introductions. As we saw, for his purposes here, the philosopher are effectively Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina. For based on the premise that they are the most reliable transmitters of Aristotle among the Muslims, Ghazali specifies that he will be limiting himself to the review of their arguments. Ibn Rushd is often critical of the reliability of that transmission, especially in the case of Ibn Sina. Hence, we will often find him rejecting one of their arguments as inconclusive, while disavowing it as not representing the thought of the so-called ancient philosophers. While at other times he cites the diversity of their views. Actually, Rushd is very cognizant of the diversity among the philosopher, both the commentators of late antiquity and the Islamic philosopher as well. He wants to explain it in terms of the problems that they faced rather than trying to hide it as if it was important to sort of paper over any disagreements and show that there's a kind of monolithic unanimity. He doesn't try to do that, which is really a good trait of his. In light of Ghazali's specific claim, as expressed in the introductions, these moves of Ibn Rushd's only seem to support his case, however, for Ghazali explains the limit of his scope of inquiry by the very fact of this diversity of views among the philosophers, recounting how Aristotle differed even from his teacher Plato. This difference, he says, is itself proof for his position. So recall that Ghazali is limiting his goal as to show that the philosophers have not achieved demonstrative certainty in their metaphysical positions, right? He says, we have transmitted this story to let it be known, that's the story about Aristotle disagreeing with Plato, right? To let it be known that there is neither firm foundation nor perfection in the doctrine they hold, that they judge in terms of supposition and surmise without verification or certainty, that they use the appearance of their mathematical and logical sciences as evidential proof for the truth of their metaphysical sciences, using this as a gradual enticement for the weak in mind. Had their metaphysical sciences been as perfect in their demonstration, free from conjecture, as their mathematical, they would not have disagreed among themselves regarding the former, just as they have not disagreed in their mathematical sciences. This implies that the posers of Ghazali's ire had been claiming that the philosopher were capable of mathematical certainty in questions of metaphysics, or at least a level of certainty that should result in unanimity around a settled monolithic doctrine. Only then would the fact that they differed on metaphysical questions constitute a refutation. So that raises the question, did the philosopher themselves claim to have reached a demonstrative certainty in metaphysics? And if not, did they give their admirers any reason to think so? And that leads us to the third lesson for the scientific mindset. Scientific mindset requires clarity and openness about the limitations of our methods and honesty about the degrees of certainty they meet and the doubts which they leave. In the second introduction, Ghazali divides disputes with the philosopher into three types: those that reduce to semantics, substantial disputes that do not contradict any religious principle, and those that do. Only the third sort, according to Ghazali, require objection. The example of the first category, that's the semantic one, is the philosopher reference to God as a substance, or jawhar, understood as self-subsisting. In the Kalam milieu, this term referred to that which occupies space. Thus, they would object to the notion that God is a substance, since he does not occupy space. Yet the philosopher and the Mutakalamun both agree that God is self-subsistent and does not occupy space. Thus, the dispute according to Ghazali, is only over the proper use of the term for God, which is a matter of religious law. You must not, however, he says, allow the true nature of things to become confused for you because of customs and formalities, he writes, thus neatly categorizing the semantic as conventional, as distinct from the natural. Yet the question of just how to draw this line animates much of the debate to come if you read the two books together. That does lead me to the fourth lesson. The scientific mindset requires clarity about terminology and at least say the effort to avoid merely semantic disputes or semantic confusion, right? Often we see people that are in debates with each other. This is in between Muslims in a lot of the polemic debates on theology, as well as in the social sciences outside in the non-Muslim world, right? The natural sciences, I'm not sure. But people sometimes seem to engage in disputes which really are semantic and without actually trying to sort of, let's say, seems like avoid acknowledging that fact, right? Trying to construe as a substantive disagreement, something which is merely semantic, yeah? And there's some reason to be critical about that move. Yet at the same time, it's not so clear that everything can just be clarified by ostensive definition, right? So we should be clear about terminology as much as possible and try to avoid semantic disputes, but we should not be under the illusion that we can achieve clarity simply by arbitrarily defining our terms. And the reason is because we're not talking about terms, we're talking about things, right? So we want our language to represent reality as well as possible, yeah? And I do also think that when people think that they can simply clarify things by ostensibly defining what they mean by this or that term, we go into a direction which is unscientific in the sense that it becomes merely ideological, right? It becomes a defense of a particular construction or representation of things rather than an attempt to try to bring our representation of things closer to the reality of things, right? The meaning of a term should be determined by the reality of the thing which it is intended to refer to, right? Not simply by a fiat, right? A fiat which may be simply motivated to give us a better position for defense of our own particular ideological position. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry about getting distracted by that. Oops, that's not ready yet. Go back to it. So the example of the second category, we go back to Ghazali now, is the philosophical explanation of the eclipses. There is no purpose in disputing this, says Ghazali, because it does not contradict religious doctrine. In fact, those who dispute it in the name of defending religion, actually, he says, harm religion. He says, for these matters rest on demonstrations, geometrical and arithmetical, that leave no room for doubt, he writes. Thus, when one who studies these demonstrations and ascertains their proofs is told that this is contrary to religion, such an individual will not suspect the science, but only religion. Yeah. By the way, the philosopher proof for their explanation for the eclipses is one based on this spherical shape of the earth, right? So we all know that it's demonstrably proven that the earth is not flat, yeah? And there's no reason to entertain the plausibility of that, even if you think that that's necessary to defend religious belief, at least from Ghazali's point of view, yeah? So he writes, when one who studies the demonstrations of the explanation of the eclipse, and ascertains the proofs is told that this is contrary to religion, such an individual will not suspect the science, but only religion. Then what if we find something demonstratively proven that does contradict religion? In that case, according to Ghazali, we must interpret the religious text figuratively. The discussion here deserves careful attention. The first thing Ghazali does is to consider an objection raised on account of a hadith narrating a description by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam of the eclipses as God's signs, where he denied that they happened because of the birth or death of any person and commanded people to pray if they see one. Nothing in this hadith, Ghazali says, contradicts the explanation of the eclipses demonstrated by the philosopher. Understanding the natural phenomena as signs of God, we may infer, is compatible with them also having natural explanations. Note here Ghazali's opposition to any pretense to a monopoly on the sources of knowledge by self-styled defenders of religion. One version of the hadith in which this prophetic saying is narrated concludes with the statement, "But if God reveals himself to a thing, it submits to him." Ghazali considers the objection that with this addition to the text does indeed contradict the philosopher explanation of the eclipses. The transmission of this version, he says, is unsound. Quote, "For if the transmission were sound, then it would be easier to interpret it metaphorically rather than to reject matters that are conclusively true. There are many cases of metaphorical scriptural interpretation," he points out, "that are made in order to resolve contradictions with things proven less decisively than the explanation of the eclipses." There are two important things to take from this. First, there is the implied rule that when a scriptural text contradicts something demonstratively proven, we should interpret the former metaphorically. Secondly, there is the implication that the statement, "If God reveals himself to a thing, it submits," khada'a, itself to him, taken literally, is incompatible with the natural explanation of the eclipses. It seems that Ghazali takes the literal sense of the term submits here as pertaining to the natural, for he proceeds to explain all this in terms of the same analogy he used above that we saw to show that there is no relation between the natural and the physical. He says, "This is because the inquiry at issue is about the world, is whether it originated in time or is eternal. Moreover, once its temporal origination is established, it makes no difference whether it is a sphere, a simple body, an octagon, or a hexagon. It makes no difference whether the highest heavens and what is beneath are 13 layers, as they say, or lesser or greater. For the relation of these matters to the inquiry in divine matters is similar to the relation of looking at the number of layers of an onion or the number of seeds in a pomegranate. What is intended here is only the world's being God's act, whatever mode it has." This seems to imply that in Al-Ghazali's view, the term submits, applied literally to an object of nature, entails that some specific physical description applies. Then when this physical description contradicts another one, the truth of which we can logically demonstrate, we interpret the former as a metaphor for a metaphysical truth. Since there is no relation between the physical, for example, the number of seeds in a pomegranate, and the metaphysical, for example, the contingency of the pomegranate, then a logically demonstrated physical fact can never contradict a metaphysical truth. As we noted above, it seems to follow, problematically perhaps, that a physical fact or facts can never entail, according to Ghazali, a metaphysical truth. Consequently, Ghazali must understand all non-negotiable religious principles as metaphysical principles. And it is only in defense of these that he deems it necessary to oppose the philosopher. Which brings us then to our fifth one. The scientific mindset requires clarity about the object and scope of our inquiry, which is to say that we should carefully define the scope of our inquiry based on a thorough awareness of our objective about what we want to do with the inquiry. However, what its actual scope entails depends on the reality of the subject matter and not on our definition of it, right? So we have to be open to the possibility that the actual scope of our object of inquiry is different than what we initially thought, right? That's open to the discovery about the thing. Yeah.
Just the clarification, the scientific mindset is a rational mindset, or is it what?
Rationality is a necessary condition of a scientific mindset. I'm not talking about positivism. Yeah, positivism is not a scientific mindset because it's a.
So what's the
Right.
what's the scientific mindset?
Well, I'm building them all of that piecemeal.
Because you're using the word and then
Yeah,
we're going
yeah.
to get the definition.
Yeah, you just go ahead. We will discuss later on.
Yeah, well, I don't want to take up an ideologically constructed notion of a scientific mindset like one the positivists would bring. Yeah. A scientific mindset requires openness and self-reflection on what it actually means to be scientific. Yeah. Yeah. So any of these can be disputed. Yeah. And most of these little lessons that I'm bringing, and like in this, for example, there's a bit of a tension here. We have to balance between two things, right? We have to be clear to ourselves what we're talking about as much as possible. But we have to realize that whether we're clear to ourselves about what we're talking about doesn't just depend on our own definition of what we're talking about. It depends on the nature of the thing and how we know that thing. Yeah. No, not there yet, sorry. So the third part is one where the dispute pertains to one of the principles of religion, such as upholding the doctrine of the world's origination or demonstrating the resurrection of bodies, all of which the philosophers have denied. It is this topic and its likes, not any other, he says, that one must show the falsity of their doctrine. I should pay attention to the time.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, no problem, okay. In the third introduction, Ghazali announces that since his objective is only to dispel the image that the philosophers are free from contradiction by showing the various aspects of their incoherence, he will not enter the argument, quote, except as one who demands and denies, not as one who claims and affirms. By this, he obviously intends to relieve himself of the burden of proof with respect to any alternative doctrine. This is generally valid, showing that one theory suffers from internal contradictions or inconclusive evidence, does not itself require positive proof of some alternative theory is true, right? And conversely, showing that the philosopher are inconclusive in their arguments or that their theory is contradictory does not prove that the Asherites are correct, right? But Ghazali doesn't, intend to imply that here. Yeah, we just have to keep that clear, right? And it's not even clear to me that Ghazali ever has, in the end, interested in defending the Asherites' theology. Yeah, but that's a different question. Ibn Rushd did not include Ghazali's introductions with the text that he copied into his Tahafut, nor does he address them. He briefly states his objective in writing it before launching straight into his review of the opening argument of discussion 1, which is about the eternity of the world. He says there, the aim of this book is to show the different degrees of assent and conviction attained by the assertions and the incoherence of the philosophers, and to prove that the greater part has not reached the degree of evidence or truth. That's his introduction. That's it. The first argument he proceeds to criticize as not conclusive is not Ghazali's argument, actually, but the philosopher argument, Ibn Sina's argument for the eternity of the world that Ghazali presents there. So if you want to look at it, it's there. The first thing that Ibn Rushd says, this is an argument which is not demonstrative. It's Ibn Sina's argument. And throughout the entirety of his response, a large number of the arguments that he criticizes as inconclusive are in fact Ibn Sina's arguments, and he's involved mostly in saying, well, Al-Ghazali criticized Ibn Sina, but he doesn't reflect the true philosophy, right? Nor does he reject, though, the conclusion of the argument, right? Because Ibn Rushd agrees that the world is eternal and pre-eternal, the cosmos is pre-eternal, but he does not believe that Ibn Sina's argument is valid, right? He believes it for a different argument, Aristotle's argument. Yeah? So he does not reject its conclusion. The issue for him, as for Ghazali, is whether the argument in question is demonstrative. Indeed, he is often as critical of the philosophical arguments Ghazali presents as he is of the objections Ghazali raises against them. If we interpret his statement of intent according to what he actually does, then we should conclude that Ghazali is not targeting only, we should conclude that Ibn Rushd is not targeting only Ghazali's arguments, but all, or at least most of the arguments for any of the assertions made in the Tahafut, whether by or against the philosopher. Yet, as we saw, Ghazali explicitly says he will not be making or defending any positive assertions. His aim is strictly to show that the philosopher are not able to prove with the demonstrative certainty they claim their own assertions on the 20 topics involved. This does not require proof of any contrary assertion. Thus, Ghazali can conceivably succeed in his aim, even if all the assertions he makes, or at least all the remotely controversial ones, are themselves unproven. Technically, then, Ibn Rushd's stated aim here is not in opposition to that of Ghazali's, but actually in accord with it. The two would be coherent in their objections, or at least in their explicitly stated objectives. Ibn Rushd seems to feel otherwise, though. This, among other features of his response, raised the question of whether he was aware of Ghazali's introductions and stated purposes from those introductions. For example, Ibn Rushd often targets Ash'ari positions that Ghazali does not commit himself to in the book, as if that were relevant to the soundness of the philosophical arguments in question. Here we will explore some other indications and implications of Ibn Rushd's apparent ignorance of Ghazali's introductions, Ibn Rushd's own minimal statement of purpose to show that the arguments in the Tahafut are undemonstrative, allows me the space to proceed on the working hypothesis that Ibn Rushd was motivated by genuine philosophical concern for meeting the challenges of the questions Ghazali raised. So also does the fact that in his own writing, he does not generally reflect the same degree of inordinate arrogance toward Ghazali that is often displayed by Ibn Rushd's modern partisans. There are, however, places in the body of the work where Ibn Rushd provides more detail about his objectives and method, of which we will review one key instance here. On that basis, I will make a case for approaching the Tahafut debate as a philosophically productive dialectic of the sort described by Ghazali in his, Al-Farabi in his book of letters. In Ibn Rushd's reproduction of the text, Ghazali's assertion of a purely critical stance first appears seemingly ad hoc in the absence of his introduction at the end of the first discussion. There, the philosopher note that Ghazali has posed problems for their argument without solving any of the questions that we have brought with them, without solving any of the problems. Yeah, you've criticized their solutions, but you haven't, solved any of the problems. And Ghazali replies, well, that his objections have achieved their sole aim, which is not to defend a specific doctrine or to answer any of those philosophical questions, but just to show that the philosophers have failed to answer them with the certain demonstrative certainty that they claim, right? In this case, about the pre-eternity of the cosmos. He says he will defend the true doctrine in a future book that he will name Qawaid al-Aqaid, the principles of belief. As fate would have it, this is the title of a brief summary of creed found in Ghazali's voluminous Ihya Ulumuddin. Outside of this chapter, the Ihya is rife with the influence of falsafa. It is thus one of several works which some have argued indicate that Ghazali was a secret adherent of Ibn Sina's doctrine. Others who argue instead that Ghazali remained a committed Ash'ari typically identify the iqtisad fil i'tiqad his most extensive defense of the Ash'ari school's creed as his exposition of true doctrine that he promises here. Ghazali, Ibn Rushd, I get all the names mixed up now. Ibn Rushd himself raises that question. He says, but this book that Ghazali has promised he's going to write next, right? Answering all the questions. He says, but this book has not yet come into my hands, and perhaps he never composed it. And he only says that he does not base this present book on any doctrine, in order that it should not be thought that he based it on that of the Ash'aris. It appears from the books ascribed to him that in metaphysics he recurs to the philosopher. And of all of his books, this is most truly proved in his book called Mishkat al-Anwar. I will here advance the working hypothesis, and that's basically what I do assume for this book. The working hypothesis that, as Ibn Rushd suggests, Ghazali never did compose his book of true doctrine. This suits my present aim, which is not to ascertain what of Ghazali's corpus reflects his heart of hearts. I don't care about that. But rather to examine his debate with the philosopher as part of an active philosophical exploration. We will assume that in his encounter with the philosopher, he was searching so that we might join the search, using the debate as a platform for speculating, in a sense, over what the content of this book of the final truth would be, were he to have written it. We thus need not ponder here over whether the Iqtisad expresses his true belief, or whether he actually wrote Mishkat al-Anwar, and so forth. For we do not intend to use any of that to impose conclusive limits on where the argument of the Tahafut could lead us. It may be that problems remain with the arguments of both the philosopher and their opponents. Ibn Rushd, it seems, would object to such a procedure. To oppose difficulty with difficulty does not bring about the destruction, the Tahafut, but only perplexity and doubts in him who acts this way, he says, of Ghazali's purely critical posture. For why would he think one of the two conflicting theories reasonable and the opposite one vain? Ibn Rushd apparently understands Ghazali's objective here simply by the term Tahafut from the book's title, rather than its introduction's extensive statement of purpose, again, absent from Ibn Rushd's own reproduction of the book. He assumes that as an outcome, the Tahafut of a theory entails the positive demonstration of an opposing theory, and that simply showing that the arguments for the theory are not demonstrative, or even that the theory is internally contradictory, is for him not sufficient for that. This requires, he says, a perfect refutation. He says, most of the arguments with which this man Ghazali opposes the philosophers are doubts which arise when certain parts of the doctrine of the philosophers come into conflict with others, he informs us. Again, as though he were unaware that Ghazali had clearly specified as much from the outset. But this is an imperfect refutation. A perfect refutation would be one that succeeded in showing the futility of their system according to the facts themselves, not such a one as, for instance, Ghazali's assumption that it is permissible for the opponents of the philosophers to claim that possibility is a mental concept in the same way that the philosophers claim that the universal is merely a mental concept. For if the truth of this comparison between the two were conceded, it would not follow that it was untrue that possibility was a concept dependent on reality, but only either that it is false that the universal exists in the mind only, or false that possibility exists in the mind only. As we will see, the philosopher argue here that since possibility has a substrate in mind-independent reality, any hypothetical beginning of the cosmos entails the prior existence of the cosmos, since its prior possibility entails a pre-existing material substrate. Comparing possibility to universals, which the philosopher, following Aristotle over Plato, claim exist only in the intellect, and ultimately in the divine intellect, Ghazali objects that possibility may also require no material substrate. The possibility of the cosmos prior to its coming to be may simply subsist either in our own estimate of imagination or else in God's knowledge. As Ibn Rushd points out, this does not prove positively that the philosophers are wrong, but only the possibility that they are. Yet that alone means that their arguments fail to be demonstrative, which again, as Ghazali specifies in his introduction, is all that he has set out to do. It therefore is a refutation of their system according to the facts themselves, as Ibn Rushd puts it, inasmuch as their system involves the claim to have achieved demonstrative knowledge of these matters, while in fact it has not. Had Ibn Rushd read Ghazali's introduction or taken it seriously, we would expect him to address the crucial question whether the true philosopher, as he puts it, that is Aristotle as opposed to Ibn Sina, really do, as Ghazali represents them, claim demonstrative metaphysical knowledge. We would also expect him to comment directly on Ghazali's specification of Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina as his sources and the most authentic translators of Aristotle among the Muslims. He would also have had much to say, for example, about Ghazali's denial of the relation between physics and metaphysics and his denial that the philosophers have a monopoly over the mutakallimun and logic. The fact that he did not address these in a specific rejoinder to Ghazali's introduction indicates that he did not have it available, and one wonders how his approach to the book would have differed if he had. Most intriguingly, one wonders how Ibn Rushd would have responded to Ghazali's description of the problem of philosophical posers who are led astray from religion by misunderstanding philosophy. For the problem Ibn Rushd has with the Ghazali's book is, in fact, that it will create philosophical posers led astray from religion by a misunderstanding of philosophy. He says, indeed, it would have been necessary for him, Ibn Rushd is saying this about Ghazali. Indeed, it would have been necessary for him to begin by establishing the truth before starting to perplex and confuse his readers, he writes, for they might die before they could get a hold of that book, or he might have died himself before writing it. Conspicuously, this implies that the readers can be untouched by confusion prior to the establishment of the truth. Only then could Ghazali have been responsible for confusing them without its already being established. Thus, by their confusion, Ibn Rushd does not mean their ignorance, but their awareness of their ignorance. So his problem is that people will become aware that they don't know what they're talking about, right? Rather than get into a state where they don't know what they're talking about. Yeah. This reflects Ibn Rushd's own iteration expressed in his Fasl al-Maqal of Al-Farabi's social hierarchy, which we already mentioned. For the masses, the antidote to confusion is not knowledge, of which they are incapable, but trust in and compliance with the public religion. The proper way to promote that is to provide persuasive, positive arguments based as far as possible on a literal interpretation of scripture. Simply raising points of doubt in the arguments of heretics, as Al-Ghazali claims to be doing here, does not contribute to confidence in the official creed, but rather the opposite. It habituates the population to skepticism and questioning the law. So that leads to two of the lessons. I actually accidentally skipped one, the first one there from before. So from Ghazali's side, we can take this. The scientific person should remember that the refutation of an argument only shows that the argument does not prove what it claims to prove. And that does not require or entail proving that its conclusion is false or that some other alternative conclusion is true. That's maybe a rule of thumb we can take from the side of Ghazali there, but then at the same time, and with a bit of tension between that, we also have to remember, I think, what Ibn Rushd is suggesting here. A purely negative project of critique and refutation without developing an alternative understanding is of questionable value. Or in the broader sense, there's a social dimension to science entailing responsibilities that should not be ignored. And this is not something which is only limited to an Islamic or society or what we think of as a religious society. It also is the same as we see in this so-called purely secular society, as we just saw with regard to the COVID crisis, right? It suddenly became an issue, not really so much what the scientific facts were, but whether or not the general public, who are incapable of ascertaining independently the veracity of those facts, were trusting of the scientific authorities, right? And they created a social problem, yeah? So that it really wasn't an aim, just like in the case of Ibn Rushd's and Al-Farabi's social hierarchy. For the general public, the primary consideration is not that they understand the scientific facts, but that they trust the people who supposedly do, right? And so too much questioning, right? Or maybe, too much scientific discussion with them, unqualified, is a problem. It's a dimension of that, right? Now, what I'm doing here is not offering, let's say, clear kind of fatwas, right, about what a scientific mind is. I'm providing considerations that a scientific mind should take seriously. And you see that in the previous one, there's one consideration. And in this one, there's somewhat of an opposite consideration. We're taking the two perspectives here of Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd and seeing, where there are tensions between important considerations that we have to balance. Yeah. In this place, however, Ibn Rushd specifically accuses Ghazali of risking this sort of subversion of the trust of society and the authorities, by having inserted scriptural interpretations into rhetorical or dialectical books. It is not clear if he has the tahafut in mind, but the points of doubt Ghazali is raising here are not against the public religion or apparent interpretation of the scripture, but rather against the claimed demonstrative nature of the philosopher's arguments for their supposedly true interpretation of the symbols of public religion, according to the philosopher model, right? The only people at risk of dying in confusion before getting a hold of Ghazali's mysterious final book of positive truth on that account are perhaps those whose faith in Aristotle has been shaken, not in the others, right? And since Ibn Rushd's brief introduction informs us that, like Ghazali, his purpose is also purely critical to show that most of the arguments in the Tahafut are inconclusive, this raises the question whether he has already written a book of final truth, giving him the license that he denies to Ghazali. If so, in which works would he have understood himself as meeting that requisite? It may be his book on dialectical theology, Al-Kashf al-Manahij al-Adila, intended for the general public, or his commentaries on Aristotle, taken to be his demonstrative work for philosophers. This turns on what in his mind would have been the function of Ghazali's book of final truth. Justified or otherwise, in his Tahafut, he has done exactly what he accused of Ghazali of by writing dialectically on matters that, according to his own standards, should not be. As in Ghazali's case, and for the same purpose, we will assume the hypothesis that Ibn Rushd has no book of final truth, and would thus sincerely like to have known what Ghazali's book on that would have said. We may imagine that Ibn Rushd is annoyed that Ghazali has raised questions in his own mind, and now he, Ibn Rushd, may die before he gets his hand on Ghazali's book. For our purposes, that is, we approach them as both genuinely searching, as we aspire to do so here, in response to challenges mutually raised between their respective encounters with intellectual adversity. Yet both also have stated aims that we will not ignore, portrayed as paternalistic concern for the intellectually or religiously vulnerable members of the public. In lieu of any substantive introduction, expressions of Ibn Rushd's rationale appear in the course of his argument, specifically where he addresses a reluctant compulsion to provide a more comprehensive account of philosopher reasoning. in order to correct what he says are Ghazali's misinterpretations or misunderstandings. Here we will examine three related places this happens. The first is at the end of discussion 3, where Ghazali argues that the philosopher's emanation theory ultimately contradicts the strict notion of God's unity that it aims to defend. The second is in discussion 6, where he charges them with inconsistency in denying God's attributes on grounds of his absolute simplicity, while also affirming that he knows. In discussion 11, he demands proof of their assertion that anything immaterial is pure intellect. And all of these challenges, notably pertaining to God's unity and knowledge, Ibn Rushd presents himself as compelled by the circumstances Ghazali has imposed to provide a more extensive explanation of the topic than normally appropriate in such a concept, in such a context. Since God is absolutely one, and only one can proceed from one, according to the philosopher in discussion 3, then the diversity of the cosmos can only proceed from God through the mediation of a series of immaterial intellects. This begins with a first intellect proceeding directly from God. This intellect knows its source, itself, and its intrinsic contingency. That, according to the theory, is an internal plurality from which cosmic plurality ultimately arises, thus safeguarding God's absolute unity. If the first intellect's knowledge of itself and its principle constitutes a plurality, Ghazali argues, the same plurality is in God. Since he knows himself and others, he then considers the reply that God does not know other than himself. His intellectual apprehension of himself is identical with himself, intellectual apprehension and what is apprehended being one. Ghazali mentions here that Ibn Sina, trying to distance himself from this infamous position, held that God knows all things, knows all as proceeding from him, both universals and particulars, in a universal way. For the implication of this is that God's effect would be superior to him. While God knows only himself, the first intellect knows itself and others. Secondly, Ghazali argues if knowledge of another would entail plurality in God, so also it would entail that in the first intellect. In that case, its knowledge of God is other than its knowledge of itself. It thus requires a cause, and there is no candidate for this position other than God. Yet the first intellect itself is already the effect of God, and as the philosophers say, only one can proceed from one. Thus, the cosmos being plural, that rule is false, and God's unity is not such as to preclude his being the direct creator of many. That marks the turning point in the discussion for Ibn Rushd, who at that point already effectively stated that God knows all things, and yet nothing other than himself. From his perspective, Ghazali has broached the topic over which he has the philosopher at an unfair disadvantage. For to understand their position on this topic requires a clear explanation of the reasoning, but this is difficult. And then he goes on to explain why he's going to break, or he's forced to break his own rule about, right, talking about metaphysics in a dialectical manner. Yeah, we are done. Yeah. So I didn't time this well. So the last bit of rules here, if I can just, what we will find here is that there are legitimate scientific accomplishments that are less than demonstrative and more than merely dialectical. And this is what we can learn from the fact of Ibn Rushd's discussion of what he claims to be these topics which are too difficult to talk about in this dialectical way. Yeah. I think this is important for us to remember as features of a scientific mindset. Also, courage in the face of our own ignorance is part of epistemic humility. Abandoning an inquiry simply because you are not an expert in the question is not a matter of knowing your place. It's just cowardly and lazy. And the last thing, and maybe the final thing that sort of sums up a difference between Ghazali and how they balance each other out. I want to say that a scientific mindset is stretched between faith and skepticism in similar way that Omar ibn al-Khattab, I think he said that the heart of a believer is stretched between fear and hope, right? So we can summarize this element of the debate in this way, where the philosopher are going to say, to everything there is a discoverable order. And Ghazali says, well, we can't know that. And Ibn Rushd will say, but if we do not believe that, then we will never search for such an order. We'll never engage in science. And Ghazali can reply, we cannot search for it without testing. And if we do not doubt that there is such an order, we won't test it. Yeah. So the interesting thing on this, at least in this dimension, is that Ghazali, even though he's presented as the sort of, the defender of faith against the defender of science, it turns out to be in a certain way that Ibn Rushd is actually the one who's the defender of faith. And Ghazali is more often pushing a skeptical approach on many claims which we would actually in modern times consider to be sort of religious faith, let's say religious and faith-oriented approaches to nature. The idea that there is a discoverable order in nature is something which I think in a modern context, we would call it kind of a religious outlook on nature. Yeah. And Ghazali is the one who often in many places in the debate pushes that kind of approach, yeah, against the philosopher, maybe pretends to have already discovered the order of nature and to have it already locked up in a box, really neat in their theory. He wants to show that's not quite the case, right? In order to discover it, we have to actually impose some doubt and some skepticism, which interestingly enough, we found Ghazali the one doing that here. And Ibn Rushd reminding us importantly, though, that we also need to maintain the sort of hope or faith in a discoverable order if we are going to maintain a scientific approach to nature at all and not just give up. Okay, that's basically to summarize. I'm sorry for going over time, and thank you for your patience with me, and I hope that you enjoyed it and got something out of it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Prof, for this very informative and very specialized kind of a lecture in a very sophisticated topic, talking about the views and ideas of two great minds of Islam. I really salute you for this approach, factual based approach on dealing with these two minds and trying to find out what is a scientific mind to these two big philosophers. I think our professors and scholars and students here who are specializing in philosophy, they should celebrate today and be happy to have 1 hour, 10 minutes on Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd per se. A very sophisticated explanations of and would like to thank our professor for his extensive reading of the two scholars. With this, I think we go directly and open for questions and answers from our philosophers, our scholars. Yeah, inshallah, just we'll make it short so that we can have more explanation from our professor and get kind of fruitful debate and deliberation. We will start, I think I have here my neighbor first, and then I go to the other neighbor. Come, go ahead, brother.
Thank you. Dr. Farouk Musa, I'm Director of Islamic Renaissance Fund. Thank you, Prof, for your talk. I'll just go back to the first section of your talk just now with regard to this question about science, inquiry, and Al-Ghazali, and why Al-Ghazali has been accused of basically destroying scientific rationality in Islam. And as you probably are aware, that in many literatures that people quoted that there's no more science in the Islamic world after Al-Ghazali. He caused the death of scientific inquiry in the Muslim world. And I believe that's one of the reasons why there was this accusation against him was because of the philosophy of occasionalism that is being adhered by Al-Ghazali. Because this occasionalism basically denies causality. in science. Because in Tahafut al-Falsifa, as we know that he was quoted as saying that if we approximate cotton and fire, cotton will burn. It is not because of fire, but because of God, either through his own power or through the intermediaries of his angels. So meaning to say that there's no causality, and when there's no causality, there's no science. Because science is basically based on causality. So you have these principles of entropy, gravity, and so on and so forth. Everything is scientific, it can be explained. It's based on rationality, is what my friend mentioned just now. And I guess that was the main concern of why Al-Ghazali was being accused as the main cause of death of scientific inquiry in the Muslim world. I want to know about your take on this accusation. Thank you, Prof.
Very good. You want to answer directly or take more questions? Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Right. This is obviously a big part of the book, right? This is the elephant in the room. The fact that I didn't mention that, right? I have about 3 chapters in there about it. A lot of it's tied with other elements of the book as well, other elements of the debate. So I think the discussion of this is oversimplified on both sides. The construal of Ghazali's position on causality in the 17th discussion is often oversimplified. And also the role of the notion of causality in science is also oversimplified. It's not quite true that causality, as understood by the philosopher as a necessary natural connection, right? The one that Ghazali is actually critiquing there is integral at all in science, right? So well, it depends, because we have another problem. The other problem is that we can't assume that the model of science is the Western one. You see what I mean? We can say that, and we can acknowledge that, the Muslim world is not in its best condition with regard to science, right? But it would be a serious mistake to understand Western science, modern Western science, as the model of science, right? There's no science in the Muslim world. There's a lot of science in the West. Is it true? There's a lot of technology in the West, but there's certain features of a scientific outlook which I think are missing there, right? Primarily the kind of sense of unity, yeah? So we have a lot of activity going on in search for technological applications, which is driven by capitalism, right? That might not be the most scientific outlook, right? If we wanted to have some independence in our ideas of establishing what constitutes a scientific ideal, right? Yeah. But given that's the case, if we were to do so, and usually the people who make this complaint are taking the Western model of science, modern Western science doesn't require belief in causes at all. All it needs is prediction, right? So you can have, it's very occasionalist. Yeah, it's very occasionalist. And there are reasons for me personally why I'm not really on with the very excitement about occasionalism in that regard that a lot of contemporary Asherites that are friends of mine are. Because I think that this simplistic model of occasionalism is problematic in many ways for Islamic theological reasons, right? Yeah, but yeah.
Thank you.
It's a longer discussion.
Dr. Nasri, go ahead, come.
Thank you very much for giving another investigation into Ghazali's viewpoint. I was just wondering, because when you read the text by a person, you normally carry some variance to your into the text. But I think you have tried to as close to Ghazali's what Ghazali said, read his text by bringing this question to the whole my query is just that first, for my readings of Ghazali, himself wrote Tahafut when he was the principal at the Islamia. This was before he had the crisis of Islam. Would it not be, I'm not sure, I'm not looking at it, but the question that you posed regarding finding the truth of what Bush had raised the question about, would it not be the place to find the truth is only now allowed or is yeah? That's one question. The second question which I have is basically how serious should we really take Al-GHAZALI when he talks about the philosophy, especially when Bush had criticized Al-GHAZAli understanding a lot of the philosophers' viewpoint, and especially today's findings of the research in the West, which shows basically that the book of metaphysics, the people thought was from Aristotle, was actually a book by coherence. The meanings of coherence. So when we look at Ghazali's talking about the fallacy, we really need the fallacy, not necessarily need we not really take it seriously. You know, that Ghazali's system of philosophy is really into really the real philosophy. We really discuss this. Now, I'm just bringing this.
Okay, bro. Yeah, clear. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, it seems sometimes really loud. Ghazali himself specifies that he is focusing on Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, right? At Ghazali's time, everybody thought that that book by Plotinus was the so-called theology of Aristotle, yeah? But it really doesn't matter much here because he himself says, I'm talking about the arguments of Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina. Most of them are arguments of Ibn Sina. Right. So what I do in this book is I look at exactly that. I mean, the first question I have is, does Ghazali understand the arguments of Ibn Sina correctly? Does he produce them correctly in his book? Or does he misrepresent them? Because usually the opponents of Ghazali, especially, I mean, we have like three sides, in fact, and we can look, there's more sides than this, but there's like the Ibn Sina, and then there's the loyalists of Ibn Sina and that line of philosophy, right? There's the loyalists of Ibn Rushd. This is all ideological and polemical. There's not much philosophy going on here, right? And then there's the loyalists of Ghazali, right? The Ash'aris. Yeah. Usually the response I get from the proponents of Ibn Sina are that Ghazali doesn't understand anything. He doesn't understand the arguments at all. And that's usually how they brush it off without reading what he actually had to say and how he produced it, you know? Most often, I find that Ghazali understands quite well Ibn Sina's arguments. And in fact, I find that he explains Ibn Sina's arguments more clearly than Ibn Sina. If you try to read Ibn Sina and his arguments, it's so many words, it's so wordy. It's like, hey, come on, you can simplify this. And Ghazali simplifies it, and usually it seems to me accurately, right? Ibn Rushd doesn't usually have an issue with Ghazali's understanding of Ibn Sina's arguments. Ibn Rushd usually has a problem with Ibn Sina's arguments, right? Ibn Rushd is the one saying Ibn Sina didn't understand Aristotle correctly. Yeah. So I don't think that the theology of Aristotle bit, that's something that was actually productive. That misunderstanding or that issue kind of produced this a lot of unique ideas in Islamic philosophy, but I don't think it pertains to the relevance of Ghazali's critique of what he specifically says he's critiquing. Yeah.
Prof. Osman, go ahead.
I don't have any question. I just want to intervene, basically, after listening to Dr. Nasrin. I think Al-GHAZAli was very serious about trying to criticize, in some events, to demolish the position of the falasifa, the meaning here from the peripatetic school of thought, because there are other philosophical schools of thought. So his target is the Al-Mas'iyun, which he regard best represented. He mentioned why he concentrated on Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, because they are the best, and therefore I just want to deal with the best. All right. So, in trying to talk about the incoherence of the philosophers, we need to refer to the two works that Al-GHAZAli had earlier written. Before he wrote the incoherence, he wrote something very, very, I mean, one of the most objective accounts of perpetuative philosophy. Very objective. He didn't lie, didn't he? Just try to present what the Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina did. So that's why he wrote the aims of the philosophers, maqasid and falsafa, and the standard for knowledge. So it's very, very serious. So we must read that book first in order to understand the background to the incoherence.
Yeah, very good comment. No problem. Yeah, go ahead. Yes. Let's see if there is any question or any comment from the Zoom. Our viewers, participant in the Zoom. Let me maybe before anyone wants to ask or give a comment, let me read one question from the Zoom here. Our friend says, Brother Abdullah says, would you consider Al-Ghazali to be a nominalist, considering his arguments found in Tahafut al-Falasifa against Ibn Sina, Aristotelian approach? You got the question.
Right. That's a good question. And like I said earlier, I'm kind of avoiding the question about Ghazali himself. What's in his heart of hearts? What did he truly believe after looking at his whole corpus? I don't want to get involved in that. I'm just looking at what he says in the Tahafut al-Falasifa. And that's a section for my next volume, because in this discussion of the soul, right? He opposes philosopher's argument that the soul is immaterial on the basis of the fact that this human soul cognizes the universals, right? Which are immaterial. And he objects that, he says, we don't accept this idea of the universals, right? And then he goes on and he gives a very kind of empirical understanding of how we form general concepts on the basis of particular experiences and the similarities between our particular experiences. Yeah, it seems like there's something kind of like a nominalism or a conceptualism involved there. Yeah, whether he throws that in there, it's only one of like 10 arguments and objections that he does. So whether it's a case of him just objecting to show that the philosopher have not demonstratively proved that, right, and not necessarily reflecting his own views, I'm not sure. Yeah. And also I'm not sure there would be, even if that was the case, I'm not sure there would be a good idea to just quickly label it nominalism, because that's a term which has a lot of baggage and people throw around. We need to carefully define what that means. But yeah, there is reason to explore that question, and that's a question that I intend to explore.
Thank you, Prof. We have our brother in the Zoom raising hand. Could you please go ahead, just open the mic and speak? Okay. Go ahead, yeah.
Assalamu alaikum all together. And thank you very much, Professor R.MOAD, for this very interesting talk. Salam from Germany, Stuttgart. I have the following question. I think it's very important to bring the ideas of Al-Ghazali, Ibn Rushd, Ibn Sina, and all the other Muslim scholars and intellectuals from the earlier times to the present day. This is very urgent for us Muslims, but also for non-Muslims to yield a general realistic view on Islamic thought and history. But I see the following problem, and I would like to, Professor R.MOAD, a question on it from an educational perspective. When we bring the ideas from Ghazali, Ibn Rushd, Ibn Sina, and the scientific principles of them to the present, one problem arises. Where are today the Ibn Rushds from today? Where are the Ghazalis from today? The Ibn Sinas from today? Muslim thinkers, Muslim intellectuals, believing Muslims who can bring together all these issues from science, from philosophy, from theology to a point that they can discuss them. Because in the present times, For example, falsafa means today cosmology, physical cosmology, for example, molecular biology, for example. And philosophy today means, for example, analytical approach, hermeneutical approach, and many other things. And my question is, from an educational point of view, Professor Moad, what could be done to become more Ibn Rushd as persons for today? Ibn Sina's, Al-Ghazalis, what do we need to bring young Muslims to a perspective they can that they can have a so bright perspective that they can identify with these persons that you are talking about? And what can Muslim society, what are the things that Muslim society must do that this can be possible? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, you want to comment, Prof?
That's a big question. And what it brings to mind, I'm not sure is going to answer the question that you intended to ask. It strikes me now that the Muslim society, when it comes to these historical figures, our relation to our historical tradition, has the opposite extreme problem that the modern West does, or modernity does, right? Right, we seem to be stuck in this myopic objective of authentically representing a kind of a historical archetype, right? And that's why I really don't care what Ghazali really thought. What I care about is, what can I learn from what Ghazali wrote as far as building and understanding, right? A concept of reality that's living now, right? What Ghazali really thought doesn't matter. Why should it matter? Only if I'm approaching it in a very taqlidi way, that the truth about things must 100% be as whatever Ghazali thought it was, even though I don't know yet what he really thought. And then I pursue for that. That's not a relevant question, right? So when I read his works, especially on these topics, I'm not concerned with what he really thought. I'm concerned with what he wrote and what was the most plausible, rational interpretation of what he wrote. What is the most helpful interpretation of what he wrote, right? And this is how we actually make use of our tradition and our predecessors and our tradition of thought in, pursuing a strong, living Muslim mind now, rather than pursuing a kind of competition about who can most accurately mimic, right? This kind of historical archetype. Yeah. Now, we're stuck in that. Right, a lot of us. And on the other hand, we have the modern approach to knowledge, which is basically cut off from the historical discussion. I mean, modern scientists pursue science as if there's not a history of science, right? As if there's no, as if what they're doing is like fresh out of the oven or something. Yeah. And no cognition at all of their history of thought and the philosophical issues that are underlying their pursuits, right? And the lack of concern for the unity of sciences, right? So I think we need to pursue kind of a middle course for our purposes, and it actually has to do with the use we make of, right, our historical figures and our historical works. I don't want to be just doing intellectual history and getting into debates about what Ghazali really thought based on whether he really wrote this book or really wrote that, because this is nothing. Even if every book that Ghazali wrote was totally fake and there was no such thing as Ghazali existing in history, that we just have all these books that somebody wrote and falsely attributed to a fictional person, right? The only thing that matters, right, is what the books say and what use we can make of them for us now, right? The degree to which they're true, plausible, coherent, that's what matters. Yeah, if there was a such person as Ghazali, he's dead for thousands of years, for 1,000 years, right? Right, right. But I have this book in front of me and I'm interested in what it says and what I can learn from it in understanding things, right? And what I can learn from these debates. So maybe that's a key to the question you asked about how we can introduce this to our education. Yeah, I don't.
Okay, Prof. Okay, let's take our philosopher here, Prof. Hisham. Go ahead.
It was a very long lecture, I must admit that. And,
Sorry about that.
I'm going back to the idea of demonstrative.
Mhm.
We're grown up. Should we take this idea whether it's demonstrative seriously or not, whether it's dialectic or not, whether it's more of whether you have the preponderance of evidence rather than an argument shouldn't be evaluated just from the technicalities. So I agree with actually Ibn Rushd. Ghazali is in the sort of way is tearing things down without building up. And that can be very disingenuous or very disheartening in a way. But I do agree with the argument that none of the arguments are demonstrative. The argument that metaphysics is demonstrative is rather absurd, unless you want to measure demonstrative in a very different manner, what the word means. So why did they do it? It's just because they wanted to see themselves as above the theologians. That's it. The theologians have a lower degree of proof. We have a higher degree of proof. And who's supposed to evaluate which is the higher degree, which is the lower degree? And it seems to be tedious in argument. How would you see that?
No, I disagree with that. At least I think that the model of demonstrative certainty, which the philosopher build and offer, is a valid one and a very useful one as an ideal aim, right? Whether it can be achieved or not is sort of secondary, because we actually gauge the evidence that we do have and measure it against that ideal, and that's how we can know how we can actually tighten our evidence, or just how weak it is. So the notion of demonstrative certainty as a sort of an ideal, as an aim, is very useful. And it's not altogether clear to me that it can never be achieved. But what is clear to me is that any claim to have achieved it in any topic should be very carefully scrutinized. And a false sense of certainty, right, is an obstacle to knowledge, right? So if we were to believe that the philosopher had achieved demonstrative certainty and not question that and not allowed that to be questioned, because as you're saying, that's just tearing things down and not building anything. Well, I think that removing false claims or critiquing false claims to certainty is the first step, because you have to open the way. You would still believing that the heavens are animals. I mean, Ibn Rushd is telling us that the philosopher have proved that the heavens are animals. And then he gives it this. Do you think the heavens are animal? Okay, so Ghazali didn't. He thought we should question the arguments that the heavens are animals. You know what I mean? So anybody who doesn't believe that the heavens are animals should say, yeah, we should have questioned the philosopher claim to demonstrative certainty.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof. Dr. Ayn, I think we will have another 2 questions because we have another 10 minutes to end the lecture today. Let's
I just wanted to add something. Yeah, but this is how I read actually Ghazali. He's actually creating a balance between science and they're saying like destroying science, but I think he's creating a balance actually, which like it's not like he denies causality. You can't deny something that's in front of our eyes. He's saying like cotton and then some things, but he's adding value to that physics. He's adding that metaphysic value to the physics. So yeah, he's adding value to what's in front of our eyes. The second thing is that if we look into the timeline where Ghazali lived, before that, it was people were into fiqh, very much into fiqh, and then after that, people were very into philosophy. So he was like creating a balance between fiqh and philosophy. He doesn't want people to go into philosophy too much with leaving fiqh behind, so that he was creating that balance between fiqh and philosophy.
That's good, I think, for this comment. Our brother, do you have anything?
Recently, I saw this on YouTube, George Saliba's lecture on the decline of sciences in Islam. He mentioned that it's not due to anything about Al-Ghazali going against
falsafa or philosophy. In fact, he said that the fact that later on, after 200 years after Ghazali, the appearance of the Baraghe observatories and discovery of stars proved that science went on. But he says this, he says that he saw decline of science and the Western catching up and later overtaking is because of commercialism. It started from the so-called discovery of New World in 1492. That leads to the technology of shipbuilding and all that. And as they look for pleasure and all that, and because of that, they bring up pleasures and they got the incentive to build things more only so they can gain more treasure. And because of that, the West surpassed us in technology. Do you agree on that? If that is the case, if commercialism and capitalism is believed to be the reason we are declining and the West is getting further, how do genuine scientists who actually believe in discoveries, not for commercial reason, can even surpass Western civilization? That is my question.
Yeah, I mean, like again, I kind of distinguish between technological progress and scientific progress. These are a little bit different, right? But in both cases, I tend to, I'm not a historian, right? It would take, you know, a historian and economic historian and so forth to verify them. But my sense is that usually these things are explained more in terms of geography, economics, right? Events like this than they are explained by culture and ideals and ideology, right? And I think usually the ascending culture, like, you know, Westerners or triumphalist Westerners, Western liberals that are triumphalist like that, like it suits their ego, right? To assume that we're on top of the world because our ideas are best and our culture is the best and it's some kind of internal thing. And so likewise, by converse, it's something internal to the Muslims who, you know what I mean, that explains the, you know what I mean, decline or maybe say relative lack of progress, right? This is usually not true, I don't think. And you notice that nobody actually talks about anybody else. I mean, nobody talks about why Africa, you know, declined or hasn't progressed, or why, you know, it's always South America, it's always the Muslims in comparison to the West. It's always the idea that the Muslims, if, you know, something went wrong, otherwise the Muslims will be on top of the world or rule the world. Why shouldn't somebody else rule the world? And really, I don't really care. I don't know why Muslims have to rule the world. Yeah, that's not an Islamic duty. Yeah, but should Muslims be scientific? Yeah, yes. Should Muslims be, you know, proficient in technology in such a way as to provide material livelihood, which is necessary and conducive to living a good life understood as an Islam, as Islam understands it? Yes, that's not necessarily technology and prosperity understood in a capitalist sense, right? We have to be independent in how we imagine our ideals, right? And then we can have an independent assessment of the state of the Muslim world and history, rather than just comparing it to the, you know what I mean, the West as the sort of, you know, model. Yeah, but there is a problem. Military, it's basically a military problem, right? Economics and military, you know, economics follows the military. So technology, which allows you to defeat your enemies, monopolize the markets, you know, seize the resources, right, will allow you to enrich yourself. And, you know, usually other things like science and other elements of society are going to excel, right? And then the societies which are deprived because of that are going to suffer in those terms. Yeah. When it comes to technology, that's the case. Science, hopefully, I think it's a little bit of a different thing. And we can, even with our sort of maybe less, it was a relatively less powerful situation, still improve our scientific outlook, right? Our mentalities, right? The Muslim intellect, I think, can be improved.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. I think we will have the last question from our sister philosopher from our Department of Usuluddin and Comparative Religion. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Prof. Muad, for your interesting talk. I have a question actually. What do you think of Al-Ghazali's position, which he concluded in his Al-Munqidh min ad-Dalal,
after evaluating the truth claims of the 4 different schools of thought at the time, that Sufism is the best way to attain to certain knowledge and truth. Or I would add, how would you consider that conclusion which he made in his Al-Munqidh, that Sufism, that the Sufi way is the best way to attain knowledge to certainty?
Right. Well, I'm taking his word for it. Right? There's a song, a popular song from 15 years ago or so. It was interesting in this regard, and I've always thought about this with regard to Sufism. It said, "I've never been there, but the brochure looks nice." That was the line. Yeah. And to be honest, that's the only way I can say, because I have not experienced this, ma'rifah. Yeah, I don't for that reason disbelieve that it's existing. I don't disbelieve that it's a possibility, but I can't say anything about it myself, right? Because I haven't experienced that. So what I understand of Ghazali is that what I can understand from Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal is that he actually pursued exactly that model of demonstrative knowledge that the philosopher have, which is, based on the idea of a valid argument, based on premises that are first principles, right? But then he asks himself, how do I know the first principles are true, right? And he says, well, I can't bring a proof for the first principles because proof itself depends on first principles. So you can't, and it seems to me that what I can understand from his conclusion there is that we depend on God for our knowledge of the first principles, right? He says that God saved him by a light that he cast into his breast. Well, this is obviously metaphorical language, right? And in order for me to understand it, I have to understand exactly what he meant by that metaphorical language in non-metaphorical terms, right? And he will say, well, I think he's going to say, well, you have to experience it for yourself, right? So I'm not going to pretend to know what he's talking about when I haven't experienced for myself. And to tell you frankly, I'm really annoyed at people who pretend to know what they're talking about when these things are talked about and they haven't experienced it for themselves, right? I suppose, right? Or at least I'm annoyed at people who expect me to say something about it, right? Because how can you, right? I agree. It's a great thing. And, if I ever experience that, I'll know what you're talking about too. It's important that if that's the case, he's telling people or wants people to believe in its possibility so that we pursue it and that we keep ourselves open to it. And I think that's very important. Yeah. But as an as a person, as an academic, I can't, or even a person, I can't claim to know something I don't. Yeah.
Yeah, Prof. I think there are several other questions in the YouTube here, but I will just read one of them here. First, this Sister Farhana says, MashaAllah, very new knowledge for me. And yeah, sorry, it goes off. And the question here by our brother Abdullah, does your research encompass Ibn Taymiyyah retrospective on metaphysics, critiquing the Ash'ari, Falasifa, Aristotelianism? If yes, then please enlighten us. Or another lecture. Okay. Brothers and sisters, Alhamdulillah, this is a very important lecture today. Our professor has raised very important questions, the way how he approached the issue and the topic and talking about the scientific mind. It's not easy in the context of the Islamic world and the Islamic history and theology to talk about the scientific mind as we talk in the Western positivistic or materialistic or postmodernist approach. So brothers and sisters, the effort done by our professor, I think, is very very commendable and very good for our postgraduate student here, for our lectures to deepen certain aspects and dimensions of what we are talking about today. For me, I consider this topic today and this lecture today one of the most important lectures we have had in ISTAC in the last maybe during my presence here at least. Very important. You know why, brothers and sisters? Just to summarize, now we are talking about Imam al-Ghazali. Imam al-Ghazali, one of the big problems in studying al-Ghazali, whether from the Latin Western approach or from the Arab nationalist approach or from Islamic approaches, is that in many ways we actually use the reductionist approach in understanding Imam Abu Hamd al-Ghazali. Because when you talk about al-Ghazali, you are not talking about a philosopher only, or a person. He hasn't named himself as a philosopher, but people put him in the category of a philosophy. But Abu Hamd al-Ghazali has that philosophical mind, philosophical approaches, but he's not only a philosopher. Abu Hamd al-Ghazali is a faqih, and Abu Hamid al-Ghazali is a theologian, and Abu Hamid al-Ghazali is a jurisprudence scholar, a man of methodology, a man who used the approach of usul al-fiqh to actually integrate logic into usul al-fiqh in his book Al-Mustasfa fi usul al-fiqh. So al-Ghazali also is not only this, he's also a Sufi, mystic person in his Ihya ul-Ulum Din. You know, those people who are talking and saying that al-Ghazali killed causality and al-Ghazali killed the scientific mind, actually most of his arguments about sababiyya and the obligation of sababiyya, because killing sababiyya means you kill the Quran, you kill the whole model of Islam. You know where you find where al-Ghazali defended causality and talk about Sunan Allah and about Asbab? Actually in his book Ihya ul-Ulum. When he talk about tawakkul and he talk about it's impossible to understand the universe without understanding the patterns, the sunan of Allah, the laws of Allah. You cannot, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the universe in that ordered manner so that the human mind can discover the laws and the patterns. So when you come and tell me that al-Ghazali doesn't believe in causality, there is something wrong. And al-Ghazali doesn't believe in the science. Al-Ghazali, I don't want to give a lecture, but I'm just summarizing al-Ghazali issue. And he was in a context, in a time where philosophy started coming to Islam, where the Islamic world was, or the Islam itself was challenged by the philosophies. So comes Mu'tazila, comes this. Al-Ghazali come and say that the philosophers cannot give us lessons in revealed knowledge, in metaphysics. They can give us lessons in nature, in mathematics, in physics, in how the world functions. We can take Aristotle, for example, as our standard, as Ibn Rushd did actually. And that's one of the problems of Ibn Rushd himself. When your standard become Aristotle, and from there you start reconstructing the whole philosophy and judging the tahafut al-falasifa from that perspective, I think that's also reductionist. So we need to understand that the war of al-Ghazali is about whether philosophy or philosophers can give us lessons in akhirah or not, in God or not, in angels or not, in the existence of God and the knowledge of God, the ilm of God. So what he was trying to say, please, you are a great philosopher, you can do great things, but you have limitations. And then from there comes the whole work of Al-Ghazali, and Ghazali is a very scientific person actually. Before he talked in Tahabut al-Falasifa, he wrote a previous book. He spent 2 years studying all this philosophy, and he wrote the book of Maqasid al-Falasifa first. And he didn't say anything there about them or talk about them or say you are wrong, or he just bring all what they have, to the extent that many people say that Al-Ghazali actually introduced the arguments of philosophers in a way even the philosophers will be very happy to see how this man, he has introduced all this in this way with all this argument. He brought their argument. So brothers and sisters, I think my conclusion will be to study. I'm not saying Al-Ghazali is perfect, or no, to study Al-Ghazali, you study him as a system builder, or study him from the various dimensions, so that you really, when you criticize him based on facts. It's the same with Ibn Rushd. Ibn Rushd also is a system builder, from a medical doctor to philosophy to fiqh to qadi to all this type of thing. So as students in this place here, I always say this: we have to use the system thinking. We have to use the multidisciplinary, the transdisciplinary, read the philosopher. It's the same with Ibn Khaldun, the same with Ash-Shatibi. Once you just start reducing them into one dimension, one aspect, you will not see the bigger picture. So brothers and sisters, I really myself enjoyed the lecture about Professor today. He actually raised in myself the old readings which I read about Al-Ghazali. You know, if you read his Mi'yar, you read his book on Al-Mustasfa, and you read them all, you see the scientific mind of Al-Ghazali, which tells you that though revealed knowledge guide you, Tazkiyah guide you, Wahy guide you, Akhlaq guide you, you must be objective, you must be scientific. And his book Al-Munqidh min al-Dhalal tells you a lot about his approach and methodology. Yeah, being a theologian who is Ash'arite, he tried to defend certain positions of Ash'arite. Maybe there we can differ and we can develop knowledge. Brothers and sisters, dear professors, doctors, our great professor, thank you very much. It was really great having you today here at ISTAC here. We really enjoyed your lecture. We hope we can buy your book if there is a discount. And may Allah bless you. And I would like to end this by thanking you all, especially our people in the Zoom and YouTube, more than 70 people from 25 countries attending the lecture today. With you all here, I think you are giving us a great hope that we can move forward in deepening our intellectuality, our intellectual and scientific thinking. And I think this type of lectures, this type of scholars will be helping us to do this. For your information, we planned for you also tomorrow a lecture by Professor Omar Al-Quraishi on Sunni metaphysics. So I hope to see you tomorrow at 10 o'clock here, those who can make it, and we will be moving forward. We will end by reading Surah Al-Asr, but before that, we would like to give a token of appreciation to our professor here. Come, Prof. This is just your lecture here. We'll give it for our. Where is our cameraman? In the middle. Okay. With this, Alhamdulillah, thank you everyone. We end with reading Surah Al-Asr. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Al-Asr inna al-insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa 'amilus Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. We would like to have a photo together here so that we remember and record in our institute that this great